have three speakers, and I guess we'll go in sequence. But I guess why I think this panel is important to, how would I say, to speak vigorously at this time is that I think we're on the cusp, and those of you who know me know I used to work in the Wall Street and the hedge fund world. I think we're on the cusp of the second verdict since World War I where anarchic free market economies are failing. And as a result, this being a political conference, I think, how would I say, you will probably see the federal balance sheet, which means all of your taxpayers and future generations into the game. The rules are in play. At least the financial sector will be re-regulated. How the bailouts will take place. All of these questions will be answered in the coming months, some in the coming weeks. Some were answered on Sunday night. This is not, I mean, anybody who read a book like Carl Polanyi's Great Transformation can't believe that we're having to relearn these lessons. But how would I say? We don't have much time to breathe a sigh of relief after 7 years of rabid Republican rule, because anybody that looks over their shoulder right now does not have to be a genius when they go to the Federal Election Commission or websites that compile that and see that Hillary Rodham Clinton and Barack Obama are up to their eyeballs in money from Wall Street. So, how would I say? That energy is going to be present as these rules for our society in the coming 50 years, 20 years, whatever, are redefined. And there have to be other forms of energy brought to bear, just as there was during Roosevelt's New Deal, to create a sense of balance. As the Chinese say, crisis is opportunity. My sensibility suggests that progressives at this juncture are not prepared to seize that opportunity. And hopefully today's panelists will start, or how you say, continue and invigorate a conversation so we can talk not about whether markets are good or bad, but what kind of, what I'll call software, what kind of systems will we build that will tend to serve all of the people who carry around a passport or a driver's license or, how do you say, play by the rules and want to feel like they're a member of something called a society. So, at any rate, let me begin with Naomi Klein, who has written a book that I think was, how do we say, made for this circumstance and many others. The Shock Doctrine, a book about disaster capitalism, and a book about how we do and do not, how do you say, different segments of society do and do not seize the opportunities presented by crisis. Naomi?
Thank you, Rob. And it's great to see all of you. I was watching CNN a little earlier today to see how this was being covered. And there seems to be a new rule, a memo has come down at CNN. We're not allowed to say the economy without saying the number one issue, the economy. Have any of you noticed this? There's a graphic. So it's like one word now, number one issue, the economy. So they were covering the number one issue, the economy. And they were giving Americans advice about how to deal with the economic crisis. And one of the side effects of the economic crisis apparently is that Americans are less inclined to travel to Europe because of the state of their currency. So they had somebody from a travel website on giving advice that they should go to Argentina instead because it had a European feel. But yet their currency is even worse than the American currency. And I happened to live in Buenos Aires for a couple of years. I was making a documentary film after the economy crashed there at the end of 2001. And it is true that the peso is in worse shape than the dollar, although it's recovered somewhat. And it's interesting to think about why the peso crashed in the way that it did. You had a convergence of factors. One was a mania for privatization. The Argentine government embraced what in Latin America is called neoliberalism and here is called neoconservatism, to the extent that there's a group of wonderful street artists in Buenos Aires, and they did this stunt one day where they went to the obelisk, which is the largest monument in Buenos Aires, and they put up a huge sign that said "closed for liquidation," because they had hollowed out the entire country, and it had this sort of strange feel when we were there of this car that had just every valuable part stripped from it. There was the water system had been privatized, the energy system had been privatized, the oil, and even the road system. They were really a two-tier road system. And I mention this because there was an interesting article in the Washington Post today about how privatizing the road system is the next frontier for the privatization agenda. They went down that road in Argentina, and you had these parallel system where if you could afford it, you had your toll roads running alongside with these absolutely decrepit roads. And Argentina, of course, had a system of crony capitalism. The privatizations were brokered between a group of politically connected corporations and the politicians in power under Carlos Menem. This also seemed a little bit familiar. And then there was a run on the banks. And when we were there, very well-known banks like HSBC and Citigroup were boarded up. And people couldn't get access to their bank accounts. So I thought that maybe that CNN advice about going to Argentina on your holiday may have been a little bit prescient about what's going on right now. Okay, I can't. But Rob, that means you have to make a little room for my glass here. Thank you. Alan Greenspan is now saying he's gone from denying there was a problem at all. Certainly, he had nothing to do with it. But now he admits that there may have been a problem, although it's the fault of high school teachers, he told me when we debated on Democracy Now! There is a problem caused by high school teachers, but it may be leading to what he is calling the worst recession of the post-war period. So I think it's worth going back and thinking about some of the responses to the post-war recessions and to the market shocks prior to that. In the post-war period, particularly in Britain, you had a lot of progressive responses to market failures. And it was precisely the experience of having lived through the war effort and the tremendous sacrifice that entailed, but also seeing what states were capable of when they put their minds to it, that made the argument possible for progressives to make that we really could not just use the tremendous power of the state to wage war, but also to build social programs, to build a better society. And that argument held a great deal of sway. After the Great Depression, the huge market shock of 1929, you had a very powerful discourse among leftists in this country and around the world that what we were seeing was the inability of the market to regulate itself, that this was Exhibit A, and that people were witnessing the falling through the cracks, and they were demanding another kind of system. Now, it's also worth remembering in the responses to the Great Depression that the New Deal was a compromise. It was a compromise that was brokered because of the tremendous power of the left. And FDR really felt that he had no choice because he was losing votes to the populists, to the socialists. And so this was a compromise. Now, I bring this up because in the book that Rob mentioned, in the shock doctrine, I focus on how the right, over the past 35 years, that has used shock after shock, crisis after crisis, to advance a radical right-wing agenda, an agenda of privatization, deregulation, cuts to government spending. Now, what's important to understand is that this agenda has been a systematic campaign against the New Deal. And I think we understand that this is what we've been living. It is, if we think about the phase of capitalism from the 1930s through the post-war period, that was a capitalism that felt that it needed to compete. And if we think about it in relationship terms, that was a capitalism with rival suitors. So it arrived with flowers and candy, Social Security, and some public health care systems in some countries, and the minimum wage. And this worked very, very well. And this was a period of the rise of the middle class. But it really did cut into corporate profits at the top. Redistribution does have an effect. And what we have been living these past 35 years is a class war waged by the elites on the middle class and on the poor, where precisely because there has been so less competition in the ideological market, we have been living capitalism in what I call its boorish phase, sort of capitalism that doesn't have any rival suitors to worry about, so sort of slouched on the couch going, what are you going to do, leave me? And sort of wants those gifts back, wants the flowers back. But I think more than a revolt against the New Deal, more than a revolt against the gains made by workers and strong unions in this period, there has also been a concerted attempt by the right in this country and around the world to study the ways in which progressives responded to crises in the past. And I like to quote Milton Friedman, writing in a preface to his sort of manifesto, Capitalism and Freedom. It was reissued in the early 80s, and he wrote in the preface, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the change depends on the ideas that are lying around. And then he goes on to say that, I believe, is our basic function, to keep ideas ready for when the crisis hits. But he came to that conclusion in part by studying the Keynesians and studying how, after the Great Depression, which he believed was actually not caused by market failure but by market intervention, and he had studied that process, studied how the left was ready for that crisis. And really what we've been seeing for the past 35 years is an architecture that was built up, the think tank architecture in this city, that is there to be ready for when the crisis hits. And when I look at the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, I really think of them as sort of, they are the ideas, they keep the ideas warm for when the crisis hits. And we've seen this again and again, whether the crisis is Hurricane Katrina, and a meeting at the Heritage Foundation 2 weeks after the levees broke, making a 32-point wish list for how to respond to Hurricane Katrina. That includes everything from school vouchers to drilling in the National Arctic Wildlife Reserve. Well, lo and behold, after the recession word gets used a few months ago for the first time, the exact same ideas start pouring out of the Heritage Foundation. Drilling in the National Arctic Wildlife Reserve. This is a great economic stimulus, apparently. And all of these ideas that are always ready for when the crisis hits. So it's easy to be ready when you have the same ideas no matter what the crisis. It certainly cuts down on policy work. But I do think this context is important, and I think it's easy to be overwhelmed by how prepared the right is for each one of these shocks. So I think it is useful to realize that they are trying to emulate actually what was a populist response to shocks and crises. And I think what I'm talking about are very different ways of responding to crises. When the right responds to a shock like Hurricane Katrina or the war in Iraq or 9/11 by immediately pushing through unpopular policies, that is a profoundly anti-democratic impulse. It is about taking advantage of the fact that people are frightened, are looking for leaders and father figures, and using that period of fear and dislocation to push through an unpopular agenda. If we look at populist responses, they are just that. They are popular, they are populist, they are bringing more people into the political process. So I think there is a qualitative difference between progressive responses to disaster and these right-wing responses. I think that it is a potentially another one of those moments, for lack of a better phrase, I'll call disaster populism rather than disaster capitalism. And part of the reason is that... Hello? Mike, disaster? Is it back? Should I project? Okay. No?
You can take it out of the thing.
Yeah. Is that okay? All right. Yeah, just to wrap up, because we want to have time for discussion as well. I think what we're seeing in this moment, it is another one of those moments where the market is revealing its inability to self-regulate, but more than that, what we're seeing is an ideological crisis on the right. Now, this 35-year class war that I'm referring to has not just advanced through, I would argue, military coups, transition periods of rapid transformation, wars, elections. It has also advanced through ideas, a series of ideas that have proven tremendously seductive in arguing in favor of the benefits of a deregulated free market system. And we all know what those ideas are. It's trickle-down economics. It is the ability to equate free markets with freedom itself, with freedom and democracy. It is the idea that there is no alternative. That's been an incredibly important a piece of the intellectual puzzle for the right. And it's also been the idea of the ownership society, the idea that we have transcended the very notion of class because now everybody can own a piece of the market, whether the stock market or the housing market. And what we see is these core ideas, all of them are in varying states of crisis. And we're going to be talking more about that. But the attempt to equate freedom and free markets, for instance, is experiencing, is actually really difficult to argue with a straight face at this point in time. You have the war in Iraq, where you have the invasion of a country in the name of democracy and freedom, and then you had Paul Bremer pushing through a radical free market agenda while the country was under occupation. I think that did tremendous damage to that to that piece of the intellectual puzzle. And then you have the fact that the most successful capitalist economy in the world right is not the United States, it's China. And China skipped the democracy phase entirely, and it is, I would argue, precisely its lack of democracy and its ability to control, in particular its workforce, to suppress independent unions, that is part of what makes it such a tremendously good place to do business. So that piece of the puzzle is no longer there. The idea that there is no alternative to this neoliberal economic model is also in crisis. And it's in crisis in large part because of Latin America and the fact that in Latin America we are seeing living alternatives to neoliberalism that are working. And that is a real problem for this intellectual agenda. The ownership society is, that is probably the biggest crisis faced by the right in this moment, even more than the failure of trickle-down economics and the fact that people have lived through this period of economic growth, economic boom, and have experienced the fact that it isn't trickling down to them. I mean, this is that is a huge problem. But even more than that, this mass eviction from the ownership society that started with the dot-com bubble bursting, continued with Enron and WorldCom and people losing their pensions, and the mania in the 80s where the idea that if a company laid off 10,000 workers, the response of a working person was not to feel solidarity with the workers who lost their jobs, but to see how their stock was doing, right? I mean, the crisis in stock ownership is also challenging that idea, that central idea of the ownership society. And now we have the mortgage crisis. And people who had started to think like owners and did believe that they had that piece of the dream are being mass evicted. So it is a crisis for the right. And the question is, what is going to be the response from the left? What is going to be the response to from progressives? Because the far right, the racist right, is filling the vacuum that is happening. And they're saying, don't be mad at the people at the very top. Let's direct all the energy to the most vulnerable people in society. And I think so much of what passes for the immigration debate is about exactly that. It's my opinion that progressives in this country have not been nearly confident enough in pointing out the failures of this system and putting forward bold solutions in this moment. Not tinkering, but bold alternatives in this moment. And my fellow panelists are going to be talking more about that. But so I'll just end with this thought, that the disaster capitalists have held the reign for the past 35 years. We are seeing right now the results of that, the disastrous results of that. And I think it's time for some disaster populism. Thank you.
David Sirota, author and columnist, has written a book many of you may have read, The Hostile Takeover, and has a new book this spring called The Uprising. David and I often talk about elite versus populist reactions, and this morning at breakfast I was reminded that 3/4 of the people in the history of the United States that have been bankers or financiers are alive today. Andrew Glenn, who wrote Capitalism Unleashed, has shown that the proportion of people, numbers and salaries making their living in finance is completely unprecedented in the history of the Republic. So I just wanted to say that, David, because before you talk, when you talk about populism, you might be talking about financiers. And if we get the rules right, every one of us might be a financier the next year.
That's right.
Thank you. Is this working? Hello? Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. Whoa. So I spent the last year traveling all over the country, all over this country, trying to take a look at the reaction to what was just laid out by Naomi. And that's why my book is called The Uprising, and it was a very tiring year. I went I spent some time with the Minutemen in California. That was crazy. I spent some time with folks trying to unionize professional workers at Microsoft. I spent some time with a third party in New York State. I was all over the place. And what I can say to start is that, and this is not a newsflash, is that people in this country are very, very pissed off. And that's understandable for all the reasons that were just laid out. And the question really is, I think, is which direction is the anger going to be channeled into? And I'll just give you a few stats to explain where we really are and why this really is, not to use a cliche, but why this really is a landmark moment. There was a Wall Street Journal poll a couple months ago that showed 67% of Republicans oppose our current trade and globalization policies. 67% of Republicans. Obviously, a majority of the country, the same thing. There was a Bloomberg poll that just came out, I think it was a couple weeks ago, that showed 70% of the country is uncomfortable essentially with the foreign direct investment situation that's going on with sovereign wealth funds and state-owned companies buying up more and more of America's assets. Now, the other side of this is that there's similar numbers of people who oppose illegal immigration and support some very, very extremist, xenophobic policies as it relates to immigration. And so what we see here is that there is really a potential to take what I would say is an uprising based on a very nationalistic sentiment. There is a very serious nationalistic sentiment in this country right now that doesn't like the idea that so much of our resources are being spent overseas and that so much of our domestic policy is aimed to help the very few in a trickle-down elitist situation. And so the question is how can we, and is it possible to, take that nationalism and direct it into something positive? Because nationalism is a sentiment that obviously has a pretty nasty past throughout the globe. It doesn't necessarily have to have a nasty future, though. Now, we've seen what the right is doing with this nationalism. I saw it firsthand when I spent some time down with the Minutemen, for instance. The right has mastered the ability to find a scapegoat that has very little economic power to fight back, to blame the situation, the current situation that we exist in, on. I mean, somehow the deregulatory regime, the deregulatory policies we've seen from the top are the fault of poor Mexican farmers who were thrown off their farm and coming to the United States for jobs. Now, obviously, it's not that simple, but that's the emotion that's being tapped into. And I can tell you from spending time with these people down there, most of these people who, just as an example on the immigration issue, most of the people that I encountered, first of all, they don't think they're racists. I would say that most of them are probably what I would call xenophobic rather than a classical definition of racism. And their xenophobia comes out of, I think, a sense of feeling utterly and completely helpless and insecure. I can't tell you how many people I met who had come down to that border to patrol that border saying that they just wanted to do something. They just wanted to do something. That, I think, presents an opportunity for us. I don't necessarily think we're going to get the Minutemen to be on our side, on the progressive side. But I think that the impulse being expressed presents a very real opportunity. And I actually think that it presents a very real, concrete policy opportunity for us. And I'll just talk a little bit about what kinds of things we can concretely hope for in the next couple of years that can start to take this reaction, this backlash, this uprising, and drive it into an agenda that actually is progressive and actually is forward-thinking. Because the big benefit that we have right now is that the right is split. The right is split. The racist, xenophobic right is facing a serious divide with the corporate right. We see it most obviously on immigration. The corporate right wants illegal immigration so that corporations can exploit labor. The xenophobic right wants to close the borders, well, because the xenophobic right is xenophobic. So the fact that the right is split, I think, presents an opportunity for us. And we have our own splits, which I'll get to at the end. So the first thing I think we can hope for is a timeout, as Hillary Clinton calls it, on our existing trade policies. Now, depending on how much you trust Hillary Clinton or any of the other presidential candidates, Barack Obama or any of the other ones who are running, I can't tell you how long that timeout will be. But I think the consensus, the fact that we're at a consensus now where we at least want a timeout from one of the major pieces of policy architecture that has created so many of these problems, or at least fueled it, is a major step forward. I think that ultimately, moving forward from that point, we're going to see a number of proposals that will actually start very slowly to reform that trade policy, that globalization policy, for the better. We've already seen two. I can give you two examples. There's a bill by Sherrod Brown and Byron Dorgan who are saying that all it says is that when we sign a trade pact, every 5 years the government has to report what the domestic effects of that trade pact were. Now, it's shocking, of course, to think that we sign trade pacts and then don't even look at what happened. We don't even care. So it's not a huge step forward. More far-reaching, we saw on the Peru trade deal when it came up and was debated in Congress. We saw Keith Ellison propose in the Rules Committee a bill that would empower third parties, environmental groups, consumer groups, and individuals with the same powers under trade pacts as corporations currently have. A corporation can take a government, a state government, a local government, to an international tribunal if that state or local government passes an environmental regulation or any other kind of regulation that the corporation can claim cuts into its profits. It's empowered under our trade treaties to do that. So Ellison's bill basically said people should be able to do the same for environmental rights, human rights, labor rights. That obviously would be a huge step forward. I think that's going to take many more years to happen. And then I think what you're going to see is, and you've seen this, and nobody has really reported this, which I find most encouraging. We don't talk anymore in this country ever about tariffs. It's a bad word. It's a horrible, terrible word. That's how it's presented. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's how it's presented. The presidential candidates are all talking about providing, in some way, shape, or form, preferential tax treatment to companies that invest in the United States. We've all heard that even John Kerry was basically talking about that. And I think Barack Obama's plan, and I'm not picking sides in the primary, but his plan even says that preferential tax treatment should go to companies that stay neutral in union elections, which is like radical compared to where we've been. This is, in a certain way of thinking about it, this is coming close to a tariff. Essentially, if you're rewarding companies for doing business in this country or for doing the right thing in this country, you're effectively, by default, in some way, penalizing companies that are engaging in bad behavior through a tax. So I think the fact that we've actually gotten to a place where, even though it's not called a tariff, we're actually talking about tariffs is an important, in fact, it's a huge step, because let's not forget that our country's economy was built, every industrialized economy was built on the use of, in some way, shape, or form, tariffs and protectionism. Now, I'm not saying all tariffs are good or all protectionism is good, but the fact that it hasn't even been in our debate at all in the last couple of years, and the fact that now it is starting, at least under the guise of, by another name, I think that's a major, major step forward. Now, finally, the last thing I'm gonna say here, because I want to get to the Q&A part of this, is that our side, this is a taboo thing to say, but our side faces a major split on this. I mean, everything that I've laid out to you, these are pretty major proposals. And our side, where our organizational strength is, where our political strength is not unified around what I've laid out. I mean, we all know about the Democratic Leadership Council. You know, that's the sort of the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. Outside of the Democratic Party, you have a progressive funding structure, at least in the non-grassroots side, who, to embrace an agenda like this, you're asking many major donors to effectively endorse an economic agenda that may be not in their self-interest. And it speaks to, in closing, something that Tom Friedman, of all people, actually predicted. He said that what's going to happen in his latest book, what's going to happen is there's going to be a realignment of the parties where, and he was hoping for this, of course, where you're going to have essentially wealthy liberals and Wall Street conservatives together in one party, and a professional class, and blue-collar social conservatives with unions and consumer groups. Essentially, I'm not delivering it exactly the way he delivered it, and he was, of course, dreaming about this and so excited to be part of the former. And so the issue is that does speak to a split that I think is potentially or could potentially happen. I don't exactly know how it will be dealt with on our side, how to actually deal with, because what he's speaking about really is effectively a split on our side. How do you get, taking away from the, not including grassroots funding, how do you have a movement funded by very wealthy people make central an economic agenda that questions how that wealth was originally accrued? And that speaks to, of course, obviously the need to build as much grassroots resource capacity as possible. But ultimately, movements do, and movements always have relied in some way, shape, or form on big donors. Let's just admit it. And so how are we actually going to, and can we bridge that gap? I don't have an answer for that. I don't know. I sure hope we can. But it's something that's been on my mind. And as I've explored, as I've gone out in this country and looked at this, at the uprising, it seems to me that for our side, because the right's got its own problems about how they're trying to build an uprising, my book looks at both sides. For our side, I think that is a crucial question. I think it's potentially the one that prevents, and this is the key point, that prevents us from going from an uprising to a real, true economic movement. Thank you.
Next, we have Sarita Gupta from Jobs with Justice. You're the National Field Director and coordinating actions, and I understand many cities and over 40 groups around the country.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here, and I want to thank my fellow panelists. It's always hard to go last because I felt like both Naomi and David brought up points, and I kept thinking, oh, I have to add that. Oh, I need to add this piece. So I'm going to do my best to be succinct here. So my name is Sarita Gupta, and I'm actually the National Executive Director of Jobs with Justice. For those of you who don't know who we are, we're a national campaign for workers' rights, and we were born out of the labor movement in the late 80s. We mobilize workers and allies on campaigns to win justice in workplaces and in communities where working families live. And in about 45 communities across the country, we bring together labor unions, community-based organizations, faith and student activists to really stand up and defend and fight for workers' rights and social and economic justice. And given this discussion today, I mean, many of the Jobs and Justice coalitions around the country have been really on the front lines of a lot of the struggles and sort of the class war as Naomi laid out. So workers and their families really across the world are suffering under the impact of neoliberal globalization. And corporate interests are reflected in government policy with little or no regard for workers' rights and environmental impacts. and neoliberal policies of deregulation and privatization are designed to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of multinational corporations and employers who know no borders and respect no national laws. This is nothing new, you all know this. This has obviously led to corporate interests having more control and power over more aspects of our lives, with even less accountability. The drive to increase corporate profits has been at the root of the downward trend in the living standards of workers across the world. As a result, a permanent underclass is being created by pitting US workers, immigrant workers, as we've heard, and workers in the global South against one another. Outsourcing and offshoring are forcing global wage levels down and cutting health and safety protections for workers and the environment. As a result, we see 175 million migrants around the world have been displaced as they seek to survive in this global economy. These corporate policies are designed to free multinational companies from international or national regulations while restricting the mobilization of workers except under conditions that are favorable to employers. An example of this control of migration is, the very hot guest worker programs that have been very debated recently in the immigration debate. Workers who migrate to the United States in search of work are treated as criminals and are forced to live and work in fear. We have seen this with the ongoing worksite raids in New Bedford, Portland, the Swift plants, Smithfield plants, and many, many others that I'm sure many of you have followed in the press. As unions attempt to organize in the US economy, we're confronted with a broken immigration system as well as corporate-driven US labor laws. When these two systems meet at the worksite, it is no wonder that it has become extremely difficult for workers to organize for their rights as workers. Our national labor laws have been weakened to the point where they have become tools for employers to use to deny collective bargaining rights for a broad section of the US workforce. There's been a concerted war on workers and their organizations driven by the same corporate interests that drive the oppressive immigration and globalization policies that I've mentioned. Weak as the National Labor Relations Act is, a growing number of sectors of our working class are being denied even this coverage. Farm workers are not covered under the National Labor Relations Act. Domestic workers are denied the right to organize into unions. Independent contractors are not covered, and so employers misclassify workers in order to shed their responsibilities to their workers and our communities. Recent decisions by the National Labor Relations Board have taken away collective bargaining rights for graduate, student employees, and private universities, and have broadened the definition of a supervisor, thus reclassifying potentially millions of workers as supervisors without the accompanying pay, benefits, and responsibilities. So this is a little bit of the war that Naomi was talking about that is being felt in a very real way in local communities around the world and in the United States. Reacting to this onslaught of corporate-driven policies, local communities through unions and grassroots-based organizations, began years ago to defend, their interests as best they saw how. It took the forms of fighting for, keep a plant open, organizing to stop the privatization of local municipal services, and cutbacks on social services, things that you all are very familiar with. However, as important as this work was in addressing the immediate needs of the people, it wasn't connecting to the larger economic and political forces that were at play. And so then something happened, right, here in the United States, and that was the battle in Seattle, right? The World Trade Organization was meeting in Seattle, and many grassroots groups, unions, activists had taken to the street with the intention of shutting down the meeting. And we all know that story as well. But behind the scene, people had been making the connections and began to understand what the WTO represented and the need to expose how decisions were made behind closed doors that affected millions and millions of people around the world. For the first time, the world's attention was asking, what is the WTO? What are they talking about? Who is making these decisions? And so this gave rise to the US grassroots global justice movement. unions, community and faith-based groups, students, and other activists began organizing larger-scale mobilizations to protest the IMF and the World Bank, the WTO, and other such institutions, in addition to proposed trade agreements like the Free Trade Area of the Americas. And slowly what started happening, especially after the battle in Seattle, was that global social movements came together to organize what was called, and continues to be called, a World Social Forum process. So I want to share some of this because I want to give some hope and give a sense of people are actually coming together, but there's huge questions as to what this means for the progressive movement in the United States. In 2001, the first World Social Forum was held in Brazil during the same time as the World Economic Forum was taking place in Davos, Switzerland. The Social Forum is still the most significant gathering of grassroots progressive forces in the world. Millions of people participate from local to regional to global gatherings. It is a global convergence of social movements, including trade unions, migrant organizations, indigenous peoples, women's rights organizations, youth movements, and others. We come together in this space to debate a range of perspectives and practices because we don't have the answers to what the alternatives to neoliberalism are. But this space is created to debate ideas out and come up with alternatives. The World Social Forum experience gave fruit to the idea, development, and founding of an alliance here in the United States called the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. And it's through this alliance that organizations like Jobs of Justice, many trade unions, and key grassroots allies have been taking delegations of people from the United States to other countries to really broaden our analysis of local struggles and how they connect to larger economic and political forces. It's also the key place where many US grassroots groups have built relationships with international allies in the global South. What is key to the social forums is the convergence of different movements, which is a long process. And there is a lot of critique of the World Social Forum processes. But we have to remember that the Social Forum is only 8 years old, and it's still a very young stage of development. And each forum has had a different form and character. Building a global convergence of social movements is not a 7-year project, and we've never done this before, so it's extremely difficult. But the World Social Forum has helped connect grassroots groups in the global South with grassroots groups in the global North. And we've, as a result, built multiple international allies and formal partnerships. I want to talk a bit, as Jobs of Justice, we have built a formal partnership as just to give you a sense of some of the new ideas and approaches that are coming out of these spaces. We've built a formal relationship with a new trade union initiative in India, which is it's an independent trade union federation that brings together not only the trade unions in India, but the social movements in India as well. We decided to do this partnership in India because what we were hearing from many rank-and-file union members, in fact, were our jobs are leaving our communities and they're going to India. And again, it was let's blame the workers in India versus let's really look at the economic forces and the political forces that are at play here. So we brought together we actually focused on call center workers, and we brought actually call center workers from India to the US to actually tour with the Communication Workers of America and meet with rank and file union members who had lost their jobs due to offshore outsourcing. And the discussions and the dialogues were amazing to understand how the work changes, the working conditions, the benefits, just the way the work is done has just shifted in just the offshore outsourcing. And it gave workers in both countries a perspective of, you know what, this is not just about us being pitted against each other. There actually are these bigger forces that we have to address and we have to deal with. So it's work like this that we're doing on the grassroots level that's really key and important, because at the end of the day, as our economy becomes more globalized, the movements need to become more globalized as well. We're also in the process of launching what's called an Asia Floor Wage campaign. And this is really, again, a space where we have challenged ourselves to think about new approaches. But if you look at the garment industry, which has largely finished restructuring, and it's really like landed in Asia, there is an opportunity for us to think about what are the new strategies when you reach the bottom or the finish line in the race to the bottom. What are new ways that we can support collective bargaining rights for garment workers in Asia and connect that to the work that's happening to support retail workers in the US, knowing that most of the garment workers are producing products for the Walmarts of the world. So there's lots of different and new strategies that are emerging. In this particular campaign, we've brought together 11 countries in Asia with allies in the United States and Europe, and we're demanding a floor wage increase. And we'll be launching this campaign, as I said, in a few months. You'll hopefully get to hear a lot more about it. But all of this is to say that it is about new approaches and new strategies in this global economy for social movements. Just this past summer, in the US, the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance and a number of grassroots groups came together to build a US social forum process. And it was the first ever US social forum that brought together a powerful convergence of people of color and grassroots working class people, communities, and struggles. Really brought together the pissed off people, if you will. And there were over 12,000 people who showed up in Atlanta, Georgia for this forum. Of course, we got very limited press coverage, surprise, surprise. However, it was significant because it was actually coordinated and really being developed by grassroots organizations across the country. We probably could not have brought together so many social movements in one gathering using any other format other than a social forum format. The U.S. Social Forum was an important process for the U.S., and it was largely because it provided an essential space for the convergence amongst movements in the U.S., but it also connected us to the international debates and struggles of the global justice movement as a whole. And the question that we kept asking ourselves is, how do we build a stronger grassroots progressive social movement in this country? Really the themes in the social forum came out of, a real life crisis in our communities. And I was really struck when Naomi was talking about Hurricane Katrina. In fact, one of the forces that drove us to really organize the U.S. Social Forum was this realization that we really acknowledged that as unions and grassroots groups in this country, we did not know how to respond to that crisis. We were so unprepared. Right? We felt horrible. We were all glued to CNN. We were watching what was happening, but we really had no idea how to respond as progressive, social-minded people in this country. Other themes of this forum were workers' rights, immigrant rights, war and militarism, women's rights, climate justice. Climate justice is another example. We all know this crisis is out there. None of us know what to do about it, right? So the goal of the forum was to really help participants see the intersectionalities of all of these themes and provide a broader political and economic context to all of our work that's largely been carried out as of now in these issue silos. I work on workers' rights, you work on climate justice, you work on racial justice, and so how do we actually break that down and actually have more convergence? So in addition to this weekend of discussions and debates, the forum actually provided a space for connections, and again, new approaches and strategies emerged. And so just to wrap up, I want to share a couple of examples of some of the really exciting work that is coming together. So as I talked about domestic workers, for example, not having the right to organize under the National Labor Relations Act, well, all these community-based groups in the US said, who cares? That doesn't mean we shouldn't still be organizing. And in fact, a number of organizations have come together and created a National Domestic Workers Alliance and are beginning to run actual organizing drives in communities across the country to organize better rights for domestic workers. In fact, in New York State, there is legislation that's being pushed right now to recognize the rights of domestic workers. Black-brown work. We did a whole caravan to build for the social forum of people in the Southwest going through the South, the deep South, and making connections around the black-brown divide and really trying to conquer the black-brown divide. Other alliance formed, the Right to the City Alliance. This is an alliance that said, what is a new vision for what our cities should look like? We know mass privatization is happening in our cities. We know there's mass development happening in our cities, but shouldn't we be a part of defining what our cities look like? And what's a different approach rather than just fighting battle by battle by battle and hoping to win community benefit agreements or hoping, what's the bigger picture? How do we take a step back and stop just dealing with the immediate crisis and actually look at the bigger system? So beyond the exciting work that's blossoming on the grassroots level, all of these various movements are continuing to engage in a visioning process of what our work should really look like in the next 20 years. And we're really challenging ourselves to push for a more significant political shift in national and international politics over the next 2 decades, and to be more strategic and thoughtful about what is possible and what it's going to take to get us there. As grassroots movements, we will continue to win local and regional political victories, and we should be able to realize some national victories as well. This could mean that we defeat pending free trade agreements. We can begin to change the composition of the US court system that has been plagued by the appointment of conservative judges for 3 decades by right-wing presidents. We should be able to achieve the withdrawal of US troops from Iraq, a change in US policy towards the use of energy sources that promote global well-being and do not deepen the climate crisis. Rolling back neoliberal policies may be within our reach, such as the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. A national universal healthcare system may be possible within the next decade. I'm sure there's people in this room who say within the next few years. And a just reconstruction of the Gulf Coast should be completed in the next 20 years. But we must also strive for a change in US culture, as some of my fellow panelists spoke about. We have to prioritize community values and people over consumerism and individualism. These values must be asserted on the national political debate, and we must openly confront the pillars of neoconservative policy. Privatization of public services and resources, elimination of government regulations on corporations, and deconstruction of the means to redistribute wealth by cutting taxes for the wealthy. And you're right, there are these contradictions even within our movement of how we do that and what's possible. But we're going to need to confront these contradictions. And quite frankly, in a lot of communities, people are now talking about we have to figure out how are we going to reintegrate a generation of soldiers, incarcerated people, tortured political prisoners, and economic refugees into our communities who've been traumatized by years of violence and abandoned by the government. So there really is no easy answer to any of this, but what I wanted to share again is what is the response and reaction of grassroots social movements to this crisis and to the economy and what the opportunities are that exist. And some of the pieces that David just raised about foundation money is exactly right. Part of this weekend I was actually with 70 other grassroots global justice groups around the country, and this was a huge discussion. In 20 years, what does funding the movement look like that's different? Because we know these contradictions exist. So if anything, I hope you walk away from this discussion knowing that there are people in the United States who are talking, and globally, who are asking these really important questions. And the question that exists here in this room is, how do we build a stronger progressive movement together? Are we ready to engage the millions of pissed off people out there? Because they're out there, let me tell you. Thanks.
Okay, we'll move to some questions. I have one question that was submitted, and it takes me back to a past life. I must pay tribute to my former employer, William Proxmire. I worked as his chief economist on the Senate Banking Committee, and that was a delightful experience, I must say, very unusual in public service. The question that was asked of me is if I could make three changes regarding the U.S. and its economy, especially pertaining to the hedge funds, if you'd like to discuss, what would I do? Well, I break this quickly into 2 parts. First, the changes I would make probably wouldn't have much to do with the hedge fund community, but I'll address that in a moment. What I would do is I would outlaw private schools. I would force wealthy and elite people to deal with the public school system and create a platform to invigorate everyone, not as an input to production, but as a member of society. Secondly, public financing of elections. I think until you get the money out of the process, people won't matter as much. And the third, and as part of that, I think some acknowledgement that media corporations are granted monopolies and that they don't get to charge advertising rates for the political process would be healthy. And finally, within those public schools, I would teach everyone a book by a man named Scott Peck called The People of the Lie. And the punchline of the book is that what constitutes evil in society is lack of empathy. That people are social as well as individual, that they are sociable as well as competitive, and that curiosity is a more important motivator than fear. And I think that would get us a running start. Regarding the hedge funds, which is a little closer to the current crisis, the first thing I would do is I would require asset side restrictions on anything that's involved in our financial system, which involves reporting as well. So hedge funds would have to report, investment banks would have to report, just like banks. Secondly, I would, and so I guess the first part is asset side restrictions, and second is universal reporting, and the third would be an examination of executive compensation in a system where they play a game called heads I win, tails the public loses. And in that context, there is a biased incentive. There's an option-like structure which encourages everybody to take too much risk because they make money on the upside and they put it to the taxpayer on the downside. The practicalities of those things are very difficult, but that's where I'd start. Anyway, that's the end of me being the respondent, I hope, and we'll go to the microphone.
This question relates to Naomi Klein's argument that when the crisis occurs, what happens is that we grab the ideas that are lying around. Given the emergence of the social forum in the U.S., given conferences such as this, and given that the Heritage Foundation and others are funded by big wealthy interests and therefore they have a much greater voice, is there a potential for us to pull together a common agenda, a coherent common agenda for when the next crisis occurs? And if we can such radical ideas be a part of a broad-based progressive agenda as the elimination of corporate personhood, or David Ellerman's argument regarding the illegitimacy of shareholder primacy?
Naomi, you want to start?
I think that they can. I think obviously there wouldn't be any restrictions on the policy alternatives that we can come up with, nor should there be. And I was really struck by what Sarita was saying about our lack of preparedness for Katrina. I mean, this is, it's particularly striking when we realize that crisis, that disaster, was so much a yet another example of the glaring failures of this economic model. Because what was Katrina? It was not a natural disaster. It was a collision between heavy weather, not a Category 5 hurricane, but heavy weather, and weak infrastructure, neglected infrastructure, and meeting a failed public transit system, a failed criminal justice system. So everything about that crisis represented a culmination of this logic, including climate change, or the logic of unrestrained growth and the inability to regulate or to stop. And yet we were sort of dumbstruck by it. And coming back to something else Sarita said, thinking back to the Battle of Seattle, and I have to say, this is where my political roots lie, and I was very much a part of that movement, and still consider myself a part of that movement, even if I'm not sure there is a movement anymore every day. But I think this is one of the reasons why we aren't further along in having those policy ideas ready, is because the Bush years have so dramatically derailed us away from building these coalitions and these alternatives that the Battle in Seattle and the World Social Forum movement represented. You know, I was at the first World Social Forum in 2001, right? And I wrote a piece for The Nation called The End of History, because that's what it felt like to be in that room. And what we were developing that policy bank, right? I mean, it wasn't a single agenda, a 10-point plan, but it was very alternatives focused. Everything from agriculture to water policy. You know, it was pretty much a, you know, policy wonk, you know, festival, but at an incredibly grassroots level. And it was really challenging the idea that you need to be a policy wonk to engage in this debate. It was, you know, farmers know the alternatives to farming policy, and that's what was so exciting about it. This, I really believe, is the terrible legacy of the Bush years. There's plenty of them to compete with. But we have been so focused on getting them out of office that so much of our energy has moved away from building those alternative grassroots movements and towards electoral politics that we, I think, have failed to build, more than failed, abandon those coalitions that we were actually in the process of building. And this is why talking about the New Deal as a compromise, I think it's really important to remember that history, that it was precisely because there was such strong grassroots mobilization and a more radical left was a real threat, that you saw the solutions coming out of government to broker that compromise. So you know, there's always going to be another election that's going to tell us that, you know, first we just have to get these guys out and then we can do the real work of politics. But we're in this endless state of deferment, of deferring, and you know, I think what I actually feel is that we're moving backwards because so much of our political energy is being pushed in this direction, and whether it's Iraq or the economy, this isn't working.
I'm Paula Brantner with Working America, and our organization goes door to door and talks to people around the country about the issues that affect working people. And we're in the process of launching a debt and economy campaign. And one of the challenges we face that after all these years of you're on your own economics, that people think it's a personal failing, that it's their own fault that they're grappling with a lot of these issues. And when they're not struggling just to get by, they're too embarrassed or just not in a position to really come together and move on this issue. So are there any thoughts you have about messaging that we can really use to engage people in this in a way that makes them realize it's systemic and not personal?
David?
Well, I'm not surprised by the reaction that you've gotten when you talk to folks, but I do think that there is a sense of unfairness and a sense of that the system is unjust in a very nebulous fashion. And I think, first and foremost, focusing on that, I think, is a way to get to a place where people are comfortable. Obviously, we're at a moment now where we're 30, 35, 40 years into conservatives telling people that if you don't become a millionaire, it's your fault. So we have to start, I think, at a place. I mean, it's Saul Alinsky says you have to start where people are, not where you want them to be. You have to start. I think we're lucky that people I think, and the polls reflect this, that people are at a situation where they understand that the system is unjust. So I think starting from that place is most important. The only other thing I would say on this is that we're also suffering, I think, from that phenomenon that Bowling Alone lays out. That a lot of the social connective tissue in our society has really deteriorated. And so I think that we need to do a better job of showing people that actually it is in their self-interest to see a common interest. I think that's one thing that our side has not done all that well. And by that I mean in the politics and in the policies of what we're pushing, I don't think we've done a very effective job of showing how what we're pushing actually is in individual self-interest, and in some ways, let me just throw out an idea here, in some ways is in businesses' interest. Now, I'll give you an example from where I live. I live in Colorado, and I used to live in Montana, both states that recently passed bills to mandate that energy companies have to get a certain percentage of their energy generation from renewable power. Now, that actually ends up meaning a lot of money for companies that do produce renewable energy, right? Wind companies, solar companies, et cetera, et cetera. So I throw that out there as just one thing to think about. That one thing that the right has done so well is connect their donors and their coalition's self-interest with their policy. You know, the billionaire pushes the estate tax repeal. Uses the Heritage Foundation to push an estate tax repeal. The obvious interests are in convergence there. Our side, I don't think, has done a terrific job of trying to connect our coalition's actual self-interest with the policy. Remember, the New Deal and a lot of the progressive reforms in eras past. We had a strong labor movement, but the labor movement, I'm not saying the labor movement was trying to make money. That's the old right, that's a right-wing stereotype. But the point is that the unions, in pushing what they push, investment in public works, et cetera, they had a self-interest in that. And I think that our side hasn't effectively shown how we can put that self-interest into expanding a progressive agenda.
Sorry, if I could just add one more thing to this. I also feel like we have to get beyond messaging. And the only time people hear from us, the only time workers are hearing from us or people in communities are hearing from us is during the elections. I mean, this speaks exactly to what Naomi was laying out in answering the prior question there. We have to get beyond like what's the right message here and really talk about this piece that David just spoke to is that what are the social connections? How do we help rebuild those and promote those? In working with a lot of our coalitions on the ground, some of whom have really engaged in electoral work, and working with lots of community allies and labor allies around elections and beyond, it's amazing how in states like Ohio or Florida or where else, it's like during the election season, tons of money pours in, lots of people are parachuted in, everyone's talking to everyone, and then the election's over and they're gone. But meanwhile, the infrastructures that could have actually been developed and built there in the form of community groups, neighborhood associations, other such entities, there's no attention paid to those things. So we never think strategically about how are we actually rebuilding a social movement infrastructure in this country that can actually get us beyond just the messaging. So that I would just add that piece.
I wanted to add something too about debt. Debt, people feel very responsible for their debts, and that's the wonderful thing about debt. It's an amazingly disciplining force, right? And if you really want to discipline a society, put it into debt. This is what the International Monetary Fund understands very, very well. Same with the World Bank. When you have a highly indebted country, their hand is weak, their bargaining power is weak, and they'll pretty much do what you say. This until eventually they default.
Does that apply to America right now?
Well, I mean, I do think it is important. That's kind of why there has to be some veneer of a rules-based system. Because once it's clear that that people aren't playing by the rules or by the same rules, then you do have this risk that you just call their bluff, and like what Argentina did. And I do think that that's what we need on an individual level, because we have a lot of people who feel very, very guilty about their credit card debts, about their larger debts, their student loans. They're carrying these massive burdens, and they're suffering privately, and they are accepting, or maybe they're getting some financial advice from Oprah or something like that. But it's a very isolating process. Now, I used the phrase class war in my talk, quite deliberately. I'm trying to use more of this language. I think we need to name what the right has been doing as a class war, and many of the people we're up against as class warriors. It's something Rob Johnson does that I like a lot. I think because one of the reasons to do this is because progressives are terrified of being accused of being class warriors themselves, right? And they're always, couching their language to not be too divisive and things like this. If people feel guilty about organizing around their debts, I think the best message to give them is look at what just happened with Bear Stearns, right? I mean, the hypocrisy of the system and the fact that billionaires are being bailed out with public money at the same time as individuals are being thrown out of their homes. We need to start using these arguments and not be afraid of being accused of being class warriors.
Just on that thought, I think some of what sells the far-right model is the idea that it's like the promise or the dream. You're an individual, and if you play by the rules, you can have this little indelible fortress, and it will alleviate your fear. Unfortunately, now you have the right to pay your health care premiums, but if you have a big accident, those premiums really just give you the right to fight about whether they're going to cover you, not the right to coverage. I think that a lot of people who bought the far-right dream are responding to the same fears or sensibilities, anxieties about intrusion from society. But what's happening in practice is that the corporatist right is defaulting on all those property rights. Now they're coming to the financial sector and they're saying, oh, for them we're going to remix property rights and you guys are going to bear a burden. So a whole lot of property rights have gotten awfully muddy, which means the promise that was there to alleviate your fear feels more like a mirage than a credible promise. Anyway, next question.
Yes. My question deals with a topic that all of you have kind of touched on, and it also was featured in the American Prospect magazine this month, and it deals with kind of the point you raised about contradictions, debt and contradictions, and we have a contradiction on this issue that I'd like you to explore briefly for us. Right now, Ward was talking, what's the Democrats' response to some of this economic challenges we're facing? In many states across this country, the dominant economic development issue has been bringing casinos. And the irony is, in Pennsylvania, you have the Bethlehem Steel Plant, which was, kind of the symbol of American industrialism and strength. That's going to be the site of the casino. And it's Democrats right now pushing this product, pushing it across the country. The slot machine is a form of pay for public services as a way for jobs. And you talk about funding. I mean, they're funding a lot of our campaigns right now on the, I don't say progressive side, but really on the Democratic side. They're big players. So I'm just wondering what we can do as progressives to start having an adult conversation about our over-reliance now on casinos as a form of job development as it relates to debt and so forth. And I appreciate the courtesy for the question. Thank you.
Let me just say that issue to me, that issue is an issue fundamentally of taxes and revenue from the Democratic side, as best as I can tell. We have lost the tax debate in a spectacular fashion over the last 30 years. And sorry, this is humming here. And that has all sorts of ramifications. The attempt to rely on casinos or sin taxes is a result of losing the overall tax debate. That's the bad news. Okay. The good news is that we are at a moment, and there is some evidence that we are starting to claw back on the tax debate. And I think it's because of what I've discussed earlier about how people feel the system is unjust. And in some places, we are learning, I think, there's evidence that we are starting to win that tax debate. In my upcoming book, I traced how this tax fight played out in the Montana legislature in 2007. Montana is one of the most anti-tax states in the country. the Republicans and the conservatives have won that state almost exclusively on the tax issue and pitting environmentalists against working class natural resource employees. The progressives in Montana managed to beat back the right's attempt to cut property taxes for energy companies and timber companies in Montana and survive that legislative session with among the highest popularity ratings the Democrats had ever seen in that state. Now, a corollary. The only way that they won that debate was by proposing an alternative tax cut, because the state has about $2 billion or had about $2 billion in reserves because of the energy boom. The progressives managed to win that debate with their own alternative tax proposal that was a tax rebate to everybody, same amount for everybody. So the good part about that is that they actually won a tax debate on a progressive tax cut message in one of the most anti-tax states in the country. The bad news is that they were still fighting about tax cuts, which goes back to the point about why are Democrats relying and what do we do about Democrats relying on things like casinos. I think that if there's any issue that every major grassroots group and anybody interested in economics can unify around as a major priority, it has to be taxes and revenues. This is I mean, you know, money is the best coalition builder, right? So the loss of revenue or the raising of revenue for progressive priorities seems to me to be at least one of the top, if not the top, concrete issue challenge that has to be at the center of everything. Taxes affects our ability to do health care. It affects our ability to protect the environment. It affects our ability to deal with inequality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I would just add one thing to that, which is I think it's tough in this country to make that argument without talking about a major cutback of spending on defense. Because it's hard. I think the part of the problem around, I'm Canadian, and I think it's easier for us to talk about taxes as a progressive force because people do not have such a tangible sense that when they pay their taxes, such a large portion of it goes directly to Boeing and Lockheed. So, I think I agree with what you said, but I think it has to be twinned, but with tackling, what I call the disaster capitalism complex, because it isn't just weapons, it's the whole privatized security state.
So I can see now it's going to be really easy. In the middle of the Depression, we're going to wean ourselves of the military-industrial complex. This is much less formidable than I had imagined.
I'm Gene Farley, and the question I have really relates to the fantastic presentations we have and the structure that's been developed. Naomi, you developed a fantastic structure, how we can look at what's going on, the socioeconomic and political issues of today that puts a lot of things in place. And you talk about taxes. We all have ideas here, yet as you look at us as progressives and liberals, I think we're dominant if we look around the country. I think we deal with reality. The conservatives deal with ideology, theology, whatever, but not reality. And somehow, we as the dominant force are so divided. And Saturday, we were at a conference, a very good conference, a review of Ritter's books. And one of the guys I agree with on most everything that was sitting next to me said if Hillary wins, he wouldn't vote for anybody. And I could not convince him that this is what liberals progressives do. If they're not perfect enough, we're going to, if the I is dotted wrong or the T is crossed wrong, we don't see there is a difference. And somehow, what I get excited about, as what I am convinced liberals and progressives are the majority, if we know how to reach them, and you talk about the grassroots, and you talked very clearly about how we need instant recall voting or instant recount voting. We need public financing of campaigns. We need to stop saying corporations are people, so we have to make sure that's enacted. And we have to get rid of this Supreme Court that said money is the same as free speech. But we can't do it until we get in control in office. And I think there is enough commonality among, maybe there's 1,000 liberal progressive think tanks or organizations around the country. Campaign for America's Future is an ideal place to start. How do we get together on maybe 4 major common themes that will unite us regardless of how the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, so we can be a maximal force in this country for change? We're crawling to it, thank goodness, because we have some good candidates. And the others are so atrocious that even the conservatives understand it. But somehow we need the lead because we're right, our left, not because, thank goodness, something has wakened up. We should be the wakers. We're the majority if we put ourselves together. That's a question or a statement. I don't know which. But I'd like, how do we put ourselves together?
The only thing I'll say to that is that I agree that getting good people into office is important, but I'll just say this: we as a movement have not used the power that we actually already have right now. There are, I don't know the exact number offhand. There's probably, I think it's above 10, for instance, state legislatures that have a Democratic governor, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. We focus very little time on those arenas as just one example. We could stop the war right now if a Democratic Senate could find 41 votes to filibuster a spending bill for the war. That is a fact. So I'm with you that we got to win elections. But I think we've already won a lot of elections, and we have focuses or loci, whatever the word is, of power that we are not using right now, because single thing we see on TV and every single thing that most progressive organizations who work in the electoral arena tell you is that the only thing that's important is the presidential race and the next congressional race. There is power right now deliberately not being used, that needs to be used, and that hasn't been focused on enough by our movement.
Okay, well, one last question.
Unfortunately, I guess if we had more time, I'd question that in terms of how easy it might be to cut the war, because most of the people there are, almost half the people fighting there are working for corporations, not the U.S. military. But my question has to do with, Naomi, in your book and the comments that you made today in terms of the neoconservatives, it comes across, when I read it, as being very U.S.-centric, because a lot of the players that you talk about are Americans, and particularly Republican Americans. And, I almost get the sense that all we have to do is elect a Democrat and the problem will be solved, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that a bit. I also, in terms of the idea of, how to prepare for a crisis from a leftist progressive perspective, I know at least in Canada, the 100-mile diet is a really strong movement in terms of food. And, I'm wondering if there could be a 100-mile economy that could, as the way I see is the only way of confronting Walmart is by having a 100-mile economy. I'm just wondering if you can share your thoughts on that idea.
Well, I think particularly as climate change accelerates, the reliance on fossil fuels for becomes increasingly untenable, and people will, I think, be forced to buy more locally, and I think that's one piece of the puzzle. Absolutely, I'm not I'm not wholly advocating a completely localist economy, but I think there's many parts of our global economy that simply don't make sense, and that's definitely part of it. In terms of whether this is just about, whether I gave the impression that it's just about voting in Democrats, as I said, my roots are in this movement confronting corporate globalization. And if I recall, there was a Clinton in power during the battle in Seattle. I do believe this election matters. I think it's important for the Republicans not to win. But this economic model that we're talking about is bipartisan. And it is global. It is a corporate agenda, and because it is a corporate agenda, and there is the highest density of multinationals, powerful multinationals in this country, it is an agenda that has tended to be headquartered in this country, but it is transnational. And I think we see that very clearly in the allegiances of our elites, where you have a company like Halliburton, just living off of U.S. Tax dollars and then announcing it's moving to Dubai. So it is true. It's a truly transnational agenda. It's a truly bipartisan agenda. I hope I do make that clear. Because I feel it very strongly. And so, I think when we talk about a we coming together, I think we need to be a little bit careful about who the we is. That Goldman Sachs is making a lot of policy for certain parts of the Democratic Party. And I'm not sure that's part of a populist agenda. And just to reiterate, I think what we're really talking about is who do we feel we have the best potential of influencing, right? And and I think that the second part of that is we're not going to influence anyone if we don't organize. There's a wonderful piece by Howard Zinn in the current issue of The Progressive, where he says that the elections matter for him for the 2 minutes it takes to vote. And the rest of the time, he will be committed to organizing, being the counterpower for whoever takes power. And it's a wonderful little piece, and I recommend that everyone read it.
Well, I think we should tie up here. And I remember the woman from Working Families asking a question about what can you do to fortify people. And I would offer at the end that the right has gotten us into a fight where we tend to focus too much on ideologies and not enough on outcomes. So I would encourage people to measure outcomes, to bring empirical evidence to the fore, and to fight off the hocus pocus, or as David Sirota would call it, the hokai pokai. Thank you.